everybody. Welcome to the Banyan Books podcast. My name is Ross McKeechee, and I'm very, very delighted today that we're joined by Jane Hirshfield. Before I get to Jane's formal intro, some Banyan announcements. Although we have people joining us from all over the world, the physical location of Banyan Books in Vancouver, BC is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Banyan Books and Sound is in its 50th anniversary this year, 50 years as Canada's spiritual and healing resource. We've been local and independent since 1970. We encourage everyone to please support your local independent bookstores. And of course, particularly Banyan Books. Every time you make a purchase from Banyan, you support wonderful programming like tonight's event. You can visit us at banyan.com, banyen.com, or come in person at the corner of 4th and Dunbar in Kitsilano, Vancouver. Be sure also to subscribe to this podcast on YouTube. Look for Banyan Books, subscribe and turn on your notifications so you know when the new videos come up, or you can follow us on any of the podcasting platforms, Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcasts, and any other place you look for your podcasts. Okay. Our guest this evening is Jane Hirshfield. She is one of our most celebrated contemporary poets. She is the author of 9 collections of poetry, author of 2 collections of essays, and has edited and co-translated 4 books collecting the work of world poets from the past. Her work encompasses a large range of influences, drawing from the sciences as well as the world's literary, intellectual, artistic, and spiritual traditions. Her first poem appeared in The Nation in 1973, shortly after she graduated from Princeton as a member of the university's first graduating class to include women. That poem won what would the next year become the Discovery Award. And at that point, our guest made the choice to set aside her writing for nearly 8 years to study at the San Francisco Zen Center. In recent decades, Hirshfield has become increasingly known as a poet working at the intersection of poetry, the sciences, and the crisis of the biosphere. In 2017, in conjunction with the March for Science in Washington, D.C., she founded Poets for Science, an interactive exhibit of science poems and writing invitation housed at Kent State's Wick Poetry Center. Her books have received the Poetry Center Book Award, the California Book Award, and the Donald Hall-Jane Kenyon Prize in American Poetry, as well as being finalists for the National Book Critics Circle Award and England's T.S. Eliot Prize. Hirshfield has received fellowships from the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Academy of American Poets. Her poems appear in a wide array of highly regarded publications and have been selected for 10 editions of the best American poetry. In 2004, our distinguished guest received the Academy Fellowship from the Academy of American Poets, and in 2012, she was elected a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. And then in 2019, she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Today, Jane Hirshfield is with Banyan Books in conversation about her newest book, a collection of poetry titled Ledger. Robert Bonazzi, writing in World Literature Today, said this of Jane Hirshfield's work: astonishing strophes of being. Jane Hirshfield stands with the finest contemporary American poets. In her books of prize-winning poetry, translations, and essays, one realizes her works are apertures into wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome for Jane Hirshfield. Jane, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Ross, for that warm introduction, which no one could possibly live up to their own, accolades. And I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. Thank you.
We're so happy to have you. Now, if I can invite you to open, just so everybody knows, this is going to be a mix of Jane and I in conversation with a lot of readings from her poetry. So I'll invite you, Jane, to open with a poem.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to start with the first poem in the book, which is a kind of pre-first poem. They call them proem, and it appears before the official start of the book. I put it there because it indicates the through line in the book of concern for the biosphere, concern for climate, for social justice, for human well-being and the well-being of all of us on this planet, human and beyond human. And it's a poem which wishes itself to become irrelevant. It's a poem trying to write itself into meaninglessness. Let them not say. Let them not say we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty. It burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned.
Thank you. I read a quote from something you wrote for the National Writing Project where you said, "Why do I write? I write because to write a new sentence, let alone a new poem, is to cross the threshold into both a larger existence and a profound mystery. A thought was not there, then it is. An image, a story, an idea about what it is to be human did not exist, then it does." You go on to say, every sentence that comes for a writer when actually writing, however imperfect, however inadequate, every sentence is a love poem to this world and to our good luck at being here, alive in it. What happens to you when you sit down to write and it's really flowing?
Well, one of the things which happens is I vanish. And the possibility of each word which arrives is all that exists. And I'm very fond of moments when I vanish, because we are collaborative beings. We are not narrow, willful, purpose-driven selves walking this earth in solitude. We are doing a great dance of existence with everything that has ever happened to us, everything that happens to others, with the great baskets, the panniers of wisdom which are held in language itself, the music, the dancing, the joy of language itself, the grief of the history of every inch on earth and the radiance of every inch on earth. So when I begin writing a poem, I never know in advance, almost never, I have different processes, but most of the time I don't have anything in mind. I don't know what poem I'm going to write. I'm not setting out with a previously crafted intention. I have a kinesthetic sense that poetry is in the room with me, and that if I listen to that inner voice, it will begin to speak. And I discover what it is that I and the world are thinking together over the process of writing the poem, and then over the process of revising the poem, which begins almost immediately. I'm looking at what's on the page to see what has been said, and I'm trying to see what might want to be said from what has been, whether the poem has found a direction that perhaps was hidden inside the direction it thought it was taking, and then go with that. So all of it feels to me much more like a collaboration than an act of will, and a surrender to the mysterious larger knowledge that we all carry within us, but need to become a bit vulnerable, a bit permeable to actually be able to hear. When I'm talking, I'm not listening. When I'm listening, a larger available existence can emerge.
Thank you. Would you share another poem with us? I have some suggestions, or if you have one top of mind, please.
No, you may direct me. What would you like to hear?
I really love homes.
So in case anybody, I live north of San Francisco in California, and if anybody is startled by the Florida imagery that shows up from time to time in this book, Ledger, it's because I spent a month writing on Captiva Island in Florida. The painter Robert Rauschenberg's former estate now invites people to come work there for a month at a time. So I was there and I saw what this poem describes. Homes. Wind this morning so strong, the borrowed Florida house shakes on its stilts over water. White pelicans, which do not resemble the spirit, write their single sentence straight through it, unhindered. Their rowing wings dipped long ago into some inkpot. Rapacity doesn't swerve before what it feasts on. To a knotfish, a bird is beauty. To a knotfish, hunger wrings out its morning swim towel and rehangs it. Yesterday's Russian drone-taken video watched on computer. Window after window, glassless, glintless. Apartment blocks, streetlights, market squares, past plunged, deafened, unstoried. Three incomprehensible men look up, wave at the camera from inside their shirts' bright colors. Around them, the no longer city. It's no longer purses and breasts, esophagi, cell phones, slippers, suppers. No fish teeming world nor its spiraling wings can redeem this. No feather, shell, word, image redeem this. The Syrian war was devastating for me to witness, all through it. There are other poems in the book which respond to the Syrian civil war. I had been to Syria in 2007 with a small group of American writers who were traveling through several countries in that area. And the first place we went was Syria, and we met with university students. We were guided by one writer and then one anesthesiologist with very good English, because they had to have a woman to accompany the women in certain places and areas. And she was magnificent. The war had not started in Syria in 2007. The war that was raging was next door in Iraq. And Syria was a country which had taken in 750,000 refugees. By the time I wrote this poem, I knew that all those university students who we had met with, their lives were utterly changed in ways I could not imagine. Whether they died on one side or died in another, whether they and their children were in some refugee camp or in the destroyed city of Homs, I couldn't know. But I knew their faces. I knew the conversations we'd had. And I have never gotten over it. So there I was in paradise, and suddenly on my computer, this video of this destroyed city, and I didn't know what to make of it. It was a very difficult poem to end. I never did quite find an ending, but I had to put something, and so I put something.
How have you found that poetry, what is the power you found that a poem can have on the reader in terms of bringing awareness to something, but also as a healing mechanism, and for you as the writer in creating it and also continuing to share it?
Well, I think the great power of poetry is when you are, well, one of the great powers of poetry, when you are utterly overwhelmed and impotent and broken, if you can find your way to words, you are no longer entirely passive within your experience. And so the simple agency of description, of phrase, of acknowledgement, first private and then public, that is, the word healing, the root of the word healing is wholeness. What is healed is not necessarily cured. The war, nobody's life was spared by my having written this poem. But by being able to acknowledge what I had seen, take it in, give it language, present in this poem the unbearable juxtaposition of great beauty and great horror that is unfathomable for us to take in, that at any given moment you can be living in a pelican-strewn paradise and witness such destruction, such utter destruction. The only way I know how to meet that experience is by bringing it into a poem. I often write poems when I'm bewildered and baffled and undone. And it's not that I am cured, but I am perhaps made whole enough to take the next breath, to open my eyes the next morning, because I have not ignored the suffering. I have not shrugged before the suffering. So that's a partial answer. That's this poem's answer, perhaps.
It's almost like you answered me with a poem, the way you spoke on it. Thank you. I'm wondering maybe if we could hear another one that I really loved. It's called In Ulvik, page 47.
Yes, thank you. So in case anybody does not recognize the name, In Ulvik begins with a sentence from a little biographical note about Olaf Hauge, and he was a great Norwegian poet. And in Ulvik, and then the epigraph, he spent his whole life in Ulvik working as a gardener in his own orchard. I too would like to work as a gardener in my own orchard. Every Friday, I would pay myself a decent living wage, taken in foldable cash from my own wallet. And sometimes, if the weather was bad, I would give myself the day off and thank myself for my kindness and answer myself, it's nothing, nothing. Go on now, put your feet up, find somewhere warm. And then I would go back into my house and think of my kindness and wonder if my gardener was warm now also, and if I was right to let myself go away from my own orchard's tending even so briefly. And each of us might be thinking too of the apples, cold and wet and hanging in outside wind and fattening on their own trees without us. And one of us first, then the other, might start to wonder a little while pushing a cut of cured apple wood into the fire about loneliness and separateness and what it is lives outside one person's skin and inside another's.
I love that closing line, what it is that lives inside one person's skin and outside another's. Yeah.
What I didn't mention about Hauge is he was a great Norwegian poet who spent his whole life making his living on 8 acres of inherited apple orchard, his family's apple orchard, but from time to time would have complete breakdowns and check into mental institutions with profound depression. Robert Bly, who visited Hauge at home and described this in one of his prose descriptions, he said that Olaf Hauge had the best poetry library in Norway on his apple farm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Did you ever meet Robert Bly?
Oh, I knew Robert pretty well. Yeah.
Okay.
We coincided over the years. We taught together. He brought me in to teach at his big conferences. We did a book together, the Mirabai Ecstatic Poems versions. That was his publisher, Beacon, after the great success of the Kabir book, had urged him to do a full book of Mirabai poems. He had done a little chapbook of them. And 25 years later, they asked him again, and he said, well, I'll do it, but only if Jane Hirshfield does half. And I kept fighting him. I kept saying, no, Mirabai, she was, you told us all about Mirabai. You can have my handful of English versions. And he said, I won't do it unless you do half. So the book even has 2 introductions.
Wow. Wow. So, well, I'm sorry. I know he just passed away recently.
Yes, he did. And it was a great loss because, he shaped the entire landscape of poetry that I came up into as a young person was changed by Robert Bly's early devotion to world poetry, to bringing into American poetry the South American poets, the Eastern European poets, the Scandinavian poets, Rilke, Hölderlin, Neruda. I don't know what kind of universe of poetry I would have discovered if he and the friends who would go to his farm in northern Minnesota and work this all out, in the 50s and the 60s, if they had not done what they had done, I think none of us would exist in the literary world we now exist in. He was transformative.
Wow. Wow. How do you see the current landscape in the world of poetry, and how has it changed since the days you're describing now with Robert Bly and when you came into that world?
Well, it is poetry, the social world of poetry, the visible world of poetry. It's a very interesting thing being old enough to have seen it go through several large evolutions over the course of my life. So when I came of age, and this again was something that Robert was very much part of, poets were political activists. The poets against the war were prominent, visible, covered in the New York Times. Lawrence Ferlinghetti and the City Lights poets, Ferlinghetti's Coney Island of the Mind sold 1 million copies. Every poet of my age has on their bookshelf, usually 2 copies has somehow come to them because there were so many of them going around. Gary Snyder, similarly, I learned a great deal of my understanding of ecosystem, bioregion, watershed. These are concepts I learned first, not from the scientists, but from Gary Snyder telling me about them. Wendell Berry, similarly. So there was a great repository of wisdom, which I think has been less acknowledged than it might continue to be. There are many current now. Many of us write about environmental and biosphere and climate and toxin issues now. But I like to remember that, Gary Snyder in, I don't know, the 50s or the 60s, when he was working on an oil tanker as a very young man, wrote about the environmental devastation of oil extraction. The Norwegian poet Rolf Jacobson has a gorgeous poem looking at the entire question of the ecosystem, written in the 70s. Robinson Jeffers was seeing it in the 30s. We have ancestors. That's very important to me. I love honoring my ancestors, and I love the poetry of the world. So American poetry now is doing its similar explorations in other realms and other ways. But in between, there were the 1990s, there was deconstructionism and language poetry. And what's interesting is to be old enough to have seen some waves come through and leave. And what it has left me with is a great sense that what the life of poetry is in individual poems. It's not in movement. Movements come and go. Individual poems, some few of them, take root and become the oak trees that mark the landscape. And that is what I care about the most. Not so much the trends, but the oak tree poems, the poems that in a high wind you can go stand under. But, so people often ask, do you think poetry is having a moment? And poetry is having a moment right now, but everything's having a moment right now. With the internet, who can tell? If you are ever at a loss for finding a bit of humility, just remember the 15 million people that any cute cat video will draw. Any cat video, 15 million people, not many poems.
Well,
and yet you probably can't shelter under a cat video 25 years. But if you find a poem you really love, it might be there for you when you need it.
I love that image of the oak trees. One of your poems that had a big moment, and I think continues to, is On the Fifth Day. Can you tell us a bit how that came to be, and then maybe share it with us?
Yeah. So On the Fifth Day was written, everybody, or many people think that the title is biblical, and the Biblical Association isn't wrong, but the real reason it's titled On the Fifth Day is because it was written on the 5th day of our last president's administration. And that was the day that the White House took down from their website every mention of climate change, and just, worse, not even just as bad, but worse, ordered every scientist in the country who was employed by the federal government not to speak to the public about their research unless what they said was vetted first by the appointee heads of their agencies. this to me was like censoring the poets. It was personal, not least because many of my closest friends are research scientists and have been for a long time now. And so in my stunned shock, I spent 4 years being stunned every single day. I never got over being stunned. I never got used to it. But this was fairly early on amongst the stunnings. And I simply began writing this poem, very much as I described writing the poem about the destruction of homes, because I didn't know how to take in this information except by writing. That evening, after I'd finished it, I sent it to 3 scientist friends. They immediately emailed back and said, can I send it to other scientist friends? And by a couple of days later, I was getting messages back from Florida and Michigan and the Badlands about how from scientists who'd received this by hand-to-hand transmission, how much it meant to them that it had been noticed. Then I'm sorry, it's a long answer to your question, but so on that same day, the same thing which caused me to write this poem was what caused the first March for Science to constellate itself. The Women's March had already happened, the enormous Women's March in Washington, D.C. And so the scientists on their side, especially some young scientists in their 30s, decided that they needed equally to do something. And they began organizing the March for Science. And when I heard about it, I couldn't quite help myself. And when they asked, they put out a call for volunteers, by which they meant, people to pick up the litter after the march. And in the little volunteer tab, I said, I'd like to help you. If you'd like to bring poetry into the march, I'd like to assist with that. And I gave them 7 ideas of how poetry could be brought to the March for Science. And they took 6 of them. And I think, number 5 was, I have this poem, and if you want to see it, I could read it. Let me know if you'd like to see it. So I ended up reading the poem on the Washington Mall to something like 40 or 50,000 people, which is not an experience a poet ever expects to have.
Rockstar.
There was a poetry tent with human-sized banners. It was the beginning of the project, the Poets for Science, which is still alive and going from place to place. It was most recently at the Broad Institute, which is a neuroscience research institute, collaborative between Harvard and MIT. And it's going next to Homer, Alaska, to the Pratt Museum there. And it's been in a medical school. It just keeps going places. So these human-sized science poetry banners and writing invitations. My partner in this is Kent State's Wick Poetry Center, who are geniuses at public engagement with poetry. And so without them, I couldn't have so much as ordered a tent to hold the workshops in on the mall. But anyhow, so that's all the background for this poem. It was then published the weekend before the march. It was given a full page in the Washington Post. And so that's how it first came into print.
Wonderful.
On the 5th day. On the 5th day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air. And the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing, factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. Bound to gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the fifth day of silence.
Thank you. How did you start to connect with science? How did you first start connecting with science?
Well, the earliest, it's interesting because while I was interested in science courses in high school, I never thought I was going to be a scientist. I just liked them because everything was interesting. But the first premonition was the earliest of my poems that I still give at public readings, written in 1982 at the end of my first, long-term true love relationship, happened to have some physics imagery leap into it. And so that's just out of the blue, there's no explaining why did I talk about the strong forces and weak forces of science in a poem written out of absolute devastation, but they came. And not that many years later, I began getting I was invited into an interdisciplinary conversation group that would meet from time to time called the Lindisfarne Association. And it was scientists and artists and people from spiritual realms. And that was where I discovered I really liked talking to scientists and learning from scientists. And after that, two other similar interdisciplinary groups. One was a book group, which was in fact pretty much all research scientists at the start who all knew each other, I found out, except for me. I was invited in by, one friend, and they all thought I was terribly brave to have said yes, but I thought it would be interesting to read books with people who weren't writers and outside of, any academic context, just normal people, which is what I consider great research scientists, normal people. And then a second similar group, which is really just a conversation group that's been meeting for over 20 years now. And they just became more and more of my friends. So geomorphologist who works on the Mars rover project, astrophysicist working on dark matter, former president of the Ecological Society of America who works on food web biology, molecular biologists, and an olfaction specialist. You have no idea how interesting the nose is and how surprising the nose is. And so over the years, their work began to come into my work. Poets are magpies, and I would hear some little fact and it would just catch. And 5 years later, it might be exactly what I needed for a poem. And so, for example, in Ledger, there's a poem called Ant's Nest, which is about an ant's nest on the top of a redwood. And I know both the people whose research study land the redwood is on, and I know the tree ecologist who climbed to the top and saw in the canopy that there were ants' nests. And this was before anybody really knew that much about the canopy. Canopy biology has come a long way in the last 25 years.
Can we hear Ant's Nest?
Yeah, we can.
It's on, if you have the page number, I don't know, but it's on page 17. I've got it here.
Okay, so just to, sometimes when you hear poems, things go by quicker than when you have them on the page. And I'll just say the first line is referring to a very famous early biology paper. So, Ant's Nest. On Being the Right Size, Haldane's short essay is titled. An ant's nest can be found at the top of a redwood. No bird that weighs less than, no insect more than. The minimum mass for a whale, for a language, an ice cap In a human-sized room, someone is setting a human-sized table with yellow napkins. Someone is calling her children to come in from a day where losses as yet remain, a day whose losses as yet remain child-sized. Size is one of those ideas that seems to magnetize my muse a little. In an earlier book, there's a poem called "My Life Was the Size of My Life." In my next book, there's going to be a poem. I haven't quite settled between two titles, but one of them, one of the possibilities is proportion. This weighing of things that cannot be weighed or compared against one another, to me, that feels a great part of the way a poem might want to think about questions of justice, questions of standing, questions of dignity, because they can't be weighed, they can't be compared. No being's dignity is larger or smaller than any other being's dignity. And yet our legal system, our political system is always arguing about these things. So this is a way that poetry can perhaps propose a different standard, a different measure, another way of thinking. Now, I love the countries now which are beginning to give the natural world legal standing in their courts. Someday, I think, we will allow animals some voice in their fate, because we will understand the world differently. We won't divide ourselves so much from other lives, other human lives, other creaturely lives, even the rocks. I get a little radical about the rocks.
Yes, I can tell that you truly are in love with all of the world.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to see that in your work. Maybe before we get to some of the audience questions, you could read. I had circled this one actually. You mentioned dignity, and your poem titled "My Dignity." I was really moved by the way you point to the fragility of our dignity.
Thank you. Do you have the page number?
Yeah, page 62.
Thank you. My dignity. My dignity drinks with me a cup of coffee with sugar and milk in a bathrobe. My dignity this day neither adds to nor subtracts from the dignity of any other. My dignity this one day closes its ledgers. Its luxury this day is coffee, sugar, and milk, is having enough to want nothing. Soon my dignity, unwitnessed, unwitnessing, will dress in clothes no one will judge for their wrinkles, in skin no one will judge for its fit. My dignity, I know, could be taken from me easily, invisibly, in a single pickpocketed instant. An errant driver, an errant rock, an errant anger. My own heart could take it. One moment drinking coffee, the next, my own breast or marrow could take it. But my dignity and I do not apologize to one another this day, nor this day profess to more than we can. I know I will someday say to my dignity, it's all right, I know it is time, leave if you must, live elsewhere. Take with you, like a good sous chef, your towel-wrapped knife and whetstone, your luck-bringing ladle.
Thank you. if you're open, we have some nice questions here from our audience. The first one is from Langston, who asks, would you be willing to speak about what the poem Let Them Not Say is pointing to in the last couple of lines? The poem turns in a surprising direction that touches me deeply.
So the last couple of lines, let them say, so I'll give you the last 5 lines. A kerosene beauty, let them say as they must say something. A kerosene beauty, it burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. I'd like to thank Langston for noticing what the poem is doing there. So I have lived with kerosene lights, and they're very beautiful. They were probably not very good for my long-term health because they put out a lot of fumes, but they're beautiful. So a kerosene beauty, it burned. We are burning our futures with our use of fossil fuels. Didn't know that back in the days that I was living by kerosene light. Didn't know it so clearly as we do now. But one must feel compassion for, we want light. We want warmth. We are mammals. We want comfort. It gave light. It gives light. We read by it. And so I am completely complicit. I have electric lights on right now. I'm not sure what they're powered by. I think Marin's pretty good, but nonetheless, it's electric lights. It's not solar. And I wanted to bring some compassion to our participation, all of our participation in this activity, which is both a conflagration of the future and is also human civilization doing what human civilization is doing, and human beings doing what human beings are doing. So I was trying to allow for the complexity of our actual existence, that the same thing which is burning the future is how I am speaking to you right now over technology which has been mined from fragile places, using an instrument whose ethics I can't really know. Who built this computer? Who built this microphone? There's so much we don't know. And yet it is both a miracle and a problem. And I wanted to praise the miraculousness of it, because I really liked having those kerosene lights when it was dark. I really liked them. I hope that's some kind of answer.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a great answer. Thank you. There's a question from Valerie, who says, hello, Jane. Wonderful to hear you. Can you say something about your experience of Zen and its influence in your work life? Thank you.
Small question. It's such a big question. I will answer it more concisely than I did on the 5th day. So when I was a young person, I was in love with writing poems. I was in love with reading. And it turned out almost everything I really loved reading had somewhere within it the seed worldview that later I came to recognize was the worldview of Zen. Worldview of interconnection, worldview of transience, worldview of shared fate, worldview of attention is the key to the kingdom. And you can find this in the Roman poets Horace and Catullus. You can find it in Heraclitus. You can find it in Mesoamerican Nahuatl poetry. You can find it in the classical poems of China and Japan. And so something pulled me from the very beginning. The first book I ever bought, I was 7, 8 years old. I bought a book of Japanese haiku. I know enough about haiku now to know that I can't imagine what I was understanding at that age, reading those poems, except that it was offering me something I felt was missing. I was growing up in New York City, and these short Japanese poems set in the natural world somehow spoke to that young girl's heart and soul straight through to my future. And so I thought when I drove down the mountain road to the wilderness monastery of Tassajara in 1974, I thought I was just curious. I knew it was the only Zen monastery that then existed in America. And once I realized that there was something there that I could participate in, I thought I'd stay a few months until I understood about what I thought of as this Buddhism business. And after a few months, what you understand is you understand nothing. And so I stayed for 8 years. And I feel, those years are in some way the diamond at the center of my life. In another way, I feel they are the left foot and the right foot of my walking. But I also feel it quite important. I don't like being labeled a Zen poet because I'm not a Zen poet. I'm a human poet. I make very few references to anything explicitly Zen, less than many poets who have never crossed their legs or sat on a meditation cushion. And I feel like anything that can be learned from Zen can be learned from being a human being. That just happens to be the path of study that was available to me and that I was drawn to. But there are many paths of study. And I think a human truth is a human truth, whatever vocabulary you put it in.
Thank you, Jane. There's a nice question from Elizabeth who says, "Hi, Jane. How do you reconcile regular life, buying food, making life's arrangements, clearing up the kitchen, with your work and art? Is it always on your mind or does it come and go?"
I'm afraid it's more the art that has to come and go. I'm a very bad example of navigating these issues. Everybody has to navigate them, and I am a person who thrives under conditions of deep concentration. I think because of that monastic training that I spent my 20s in concentrated undistraction doing just one thing. And so that is the way I work best as a poet. And it is not very available to me. If you hear a small meowing, there's a cat who suddenly is crying for attention. So we'll see how that goes. And there you have it. If a cat cries for attention, you give the cat your attention because the cat is crying. And I think that is the microcosm answer to this question. If I have to buy groceries, no, I'm not writing a poem. If I'm sending out political letters and postcards, which I did every day for the 4 years of the last presidency, I took some action, some outward action to try to add one decibel to the chorus, one molecule of pressure on the tiller of we've got to change our direction. And that really mattered to me. It was not something I could set aside. And if I wrote a poem or if I gave a reading and I was talking about these things, that counted as that day's action. But for me, it is a difficult thing to navigate. And all I can say is if I go too long, I'm not a person who writes every day if I'm not at an artist retreat. If I go too long without writing, I begin to miss it the way you would miss seeing the person you love most in the world. And when I begin to miss it that badly, I know it will return.
Mm.
But often I write when I have something to say. I write when I have to write. And I'm not a very good writer if I try to force myself to. Many of my friends are daily writers. If you're able to do it, I think it's better. You keep your instrument in tune. You make more accidental discoveries. But I can only do that from time to time under the right conditions, because I have to be so vulnerable to write a poem. I have to take off my first skin, my second skin, my third skin, my fourth skin. And if I also have to remember that, oh, at 1:30, I need to go leave for such and such an appointment, I can't afford to take those skins off. So that's how it is for me. Don't follow my example.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more audience question. This is from Tim, who says, Jane, you are acquainted with the various traditions of poetic form and style. What do you notice about the way poems are presenting themselves to us today? Where do you see innovation that deserves attention? Who are 3 newer poets who might offer us clues of emergence?
Marvelous question. I always dread the list because I'll think of somebody after we're not online anymore, and I'll say, why didn't I say? I think we are at a time of profoundly interesting both expression of subject. Okay, slight backtrack. I believe that the entire history of lyric poetry is a history of including more and more subject matters into the lyric poem. You can't think of any poem in Western literary history, I don't know the rest of the world well enough to say, in which a father is talking about fatherhood and having children until the middle of the 20th century. That's one example of the expansion of the lyric poem. And right now we are in explosive expansion of who gets to speak, who gets to tell the story, what language do they tell it in, and how do they tell it? So it's a really exciting moment that way. And the same people who are bringing in the new voices and the new histories and the new lineages and the new traditions and the hybridity of all of that are also experimenting powerfully with how they are working with the materials. And so I will give as 2 examples of that first, and then I'm sort of trying to figure out desperately what's the third best example to give. But 2 examples of that are the newest book by Kaveh Akbar. I happen to, it's totally accident, I didn't plan this, it's sitting right here. So Pilgrim Bell is Kaveh. This is the reader's, advanced reader's copy, but that's what it looks like. And in this book, he has a great many poems that use the punctuation mark in original and distinctive ways to make the phrases be set off and independent and hold their own, the same way that many years ago Alice Notley was doing with parentheses marks. So that's, and he's just, he's been a poet who has been thrilling to me since the first poem of his I stumbled across. I sort of stopped and went, who's this? Similarly, in a very different way of a unique presentation of the materials, Ilya Kaminsky's most recent book, Deaf Republic. And that's a couple of years old, but I consider a couple of years old still quite new. And just a stunning presentational, dramatic, lyrically punch in the diaphragm exploration. And Ilya, for anyone who doesn't know him, came to America from Odessa as a teenager and has been profoundly deaf since early childhood because of, I think it was untreated measles, something like that. And yet there is no and yet about it. He has, in this second language, English, the musicality and force of his work is incredible. And then, the third younger poet, who's, because I'm trying to move around the map of it, Danusha Lamaris is a poet who I just think is extraordinary. And she is a poet of Dutch Barbados heritage and lives here in California. And she is writing poems that just, explore the world in lyrics which are rich and diverse and informative. She's the least experimental of the three I'm giving, but I wanted to give you poems of different aesthetics because sometimes the new is not necessarily new on the surface. It's not necessarily that it looks different on the page. The new is new perceptions in any form. The cat is meowing wildly. I think he has another poet he'd like to suggest, but I didn't cat, so I can't say. You just saw his tail pass behind me. Okay, what else?
Well, thank you. I mean, that's an amazing description of those three poets being put on the spot like that and being able to speak on each of them with such depth. Thank you. We're getting towards the end of our time, and it would be lovely to close with a poem. I'll just take a moment to thank our live audience for being here and for all of your wonderful questions. It's so great to have people here live and to be engaging and participating like that. A big thanks to Jacob Steele, our podcast producer and events curator, who does so much for Banyan Books, and to Colin Limworth, the owner of Banyan, who's been at it for 50 years and still going strong. And of course, all the staff at Banyan Books. And Jane Hirshfield, it's really, really an honor and a delight to speak to you this evening. Just so everybody knows, again, we've been speaking about her newest book titled Ledger. And of course, it's available at banyan.com.
Thank you. And out in paperback now. Okay. So when we talked about closing with a poem, we were saying, what from Ledger, and I said, well, maybe I should read a new poem. And so this is a poem written since the book. So here's an early view of the next book, whatever that will end up being. It's a poem called I Would Like. I would like my living to inhabit me the way rain, sun, and their wanting inhabit a fig or apple. I would like to meet it also in pieces, scattered. A conversation set down on a long hallway table, a disappointment pocketed inside a jacket, some long ago irritation glimpsed, half recognized in the corner of a thrift store painting. To discover my happiness walking first toward, then away from me down a stairwell on two strong legs all its own. Also the uncountable wheat stalks, how many times broken, beaten, before entering the marriage of oven and bread. Let me find my life in that too. In my moments of clumsiness, solitude, in days of vertigo and hesitation, in the many year ends that found me standing on top of a stovetop to take down a track light. In my nights asked, sometimes answered questions. I would like to add to my life, while we are still living, a little salt and butter, one more slice of the edible apple, a teaspoon of jam, from the long simmered fig, to taste as if something tasted for the first time what we will have become then. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Wow, thank you, Jane Hirshfield. It's been so good to have you.